Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm speaking on behalf of our digital motor biomarker group, and my co-lead is Andreas, who's an MD in Tübingen. I actually did my postdoc in Tübingen with Lukas Scholz, and one of my colleagues is Matis Stanovčić. So I've had a lot to do with my German colleagues, but I am based in Australia now. So I'm all the way down the other end of the world in Melbourne. I'm pleased to say it's actually still daylight here as well. So it's 6 o'clock in the evening in your future. Today I'm going to talk, I do have some disclosure. I do work with a lot of pharmaceutical industries, companies, and I will try to provide some of that experience through the talk today. But I have been paid by a number of them. I don't list them anymore, but if you think that I am promoting various companies or industries, I have involvement with a number of them, and I'll try to highlight that when I'm going through. The learning objectives of today are to just talk generally about digital biomarkers. I've got bio in parenthesis there because they are markers of disease. They're not necessarily biologically driven in the context of these motor measures, but we can go into that more. When you might use these technologies, how they may be applied in clinical care and clinical trials. A little bit of background onto what we need to do to gain regulatory approval for these markers in ataxia. And I'm going to go in a little bit of detail into the working groups that we have within our broader working group itself. So the outline is what domains are typically target within digital markers, and the biomarker groups that we have within our cohort. They focus on gait and balance, upper limbs, smartphone, which is not really a domain, but it's more a technology, speech and oculomotor. There are others that are important in that context. First up, I would like a little bit of context in terms of what professional background we have. I know there's actually a small number of people on this call, and many people join afterwards, but the first question we have is, what is your professional background? So Berta, if you could.
You should now see the polls, and please vote. What's your professional background?
Hopefully you can all remember what you do during your day job. And we will see what that looks like. We have 8 people who don't want to vote, and then a bunch of neurologists. Okay, well, good audience, because a lot of this technology is something that you may or may not want to use in your clinic or clinical practice. So a digital marker is an objective, quantifiable, physiological or behavioral measure. So the important points there are that it's quantifiable and objective. The difference between what we do as clinicians and what the digital markers do is that we are typically subjective, and the tools that we're proposing here are objective. They can, we're focusing mainly on things like wearables and portables in our working groups, but they can also be implantable and digestible. The domains that you can assess, again, are covered largely by our groups. We don't have a cognitive group, but that's probably one of the earlier technologies that have used digital approaches before this whole field was given a boost by advances in technology. And activity is something that we're all quite familiar with, given that we all probably have a smartphone. So the potential value of a digital endpoint, and I'm stressing that, there's potential there because not many of us use these in clinical practice on a day-to-day basis. There are people who are proposing that a digital technology can act as a digital twin. So it's effectively an objective measure of what we would do as a clinician or a physician. And that can include things like upper limb movement, oculomotor movement, and obviously these things are very important in an ataxia. They can also measure your speech and your cognition. They can look at your activities of daily living. So if they can provide an objective measure of that, then there may be some value in it. They can be used outside of the clinic. So you can appreciate in specialists or tertiary clinics like an Ataxia clinic, you may only see a patient every 6 months or every 12 months. Here we can get data outside of that. Scalable is important because there's a lot of interest in using digital technology in clinical trials, and they need to be capable of being rolled out to multiple sites and multiple languages simultaneously. If you are going to use them in clinical practice and trials, they need to be repeatable and not too susceptible to variability of a patient. So that repeatability and scalability are very important. I've got a couple of questions early on because I wanted to get a flavour for what people were thinking. But what is the most important use case for digital markers in ataxia? And I'm asking this early because I would like to know what people think they would use a digital marker for. Is it something that maps onto disease severity? Does it actually assist in diagnosis? Is it more important to have something that maps onto quality of life? Is it just something that tells us if something has changed? You know, that's very important for differential diagnosis of other conditions like frontotemporal dementia, where the change is actually equally as meaningful to the initial signs. Is it designed to replace the clinician, or is it simply something that runs alongside? So if you could just provide your knowledge and thoughts on this, that'd be great. I probably should have provided another option, and that might be all of the above, because there are proponents of each aspect of these answers, and there's probably a company that represents what they are as well. Okay, so we've got a couple of people suggesting its relationship to disease severity, its ability to measure change over time, and as an objective digital twin to the clinician. I think all of those answers are right in varying degrees. It can be quite challenging to map onto overall disease severity unless you encapsulate a number of domains of assessment. There's certainly in my field, speech, people have been trying to use speech as like a digital, like the equivalent of a fingerprint, where it can tell you exactly what's going on with the patient. I can assure you that diagnosis of speech is not possible. It can assist in the diagnosis, but if someone's telling you that it can be used as diagnostic, then I think they are suggesting something that's not true, to put it nicely. As a caveat, I do run a technology company and we are a digital endpoint, but we meet a number of vendors, so companies who are providing services to clinical trials with very shiny technology that doesn't actually do anything useful. It might measure something in a really fancy way, but it doesn't actually tell you something about the patient that we need to know. So this is going back to that original question around, are we looking at disease severity or general neurological health? Because perhaps we can use this information to tell us pre-symptomatic information. I've got a bit of data on that. It's certainly appropriate for those dominantly inherited ataxias where we try to find subtle markers of change prior to diagnosis. A differential diagnosis is a tricky one, but being able to provide a valuable digital marker requires that we have a good understanding of what change looks like and what stability can tell us. Because if we don't know how stable something is, then we may be making false assumptions about changes in performance based on just testing someone rather than an actual disease change. I really like questions, don't I? This is the third or fourth of the 4 questions that I have. And the last one is right down the other end of the talk. So this will be the last bit of work you have to do for the next 20 minutes. What's the primary barrier to broader use of digital markers in clinical practice? Those who are attending this talk may be interested in finding out what they are and perhaps what the options are available to them. But I'm curious to know why you're not already using them, because I use some of them in our clinical practice already. So what are the barriers to using digital markers in your clinical practice or research at the moment? Is it because of cost? Is it because there are so many choices that you can't work out what the best ones are? And I'm hopefully going to help you make those decisions today. Perhaps you don't think the data is high quality just yet, or you're just not sure what they actually do. That would make it clear why you're here. Or they don't work as well as a clinician. So what are the options here? I have got all of the above. Not to bias you, but I do find the number of choices quite confronting. There are so many different domains of assessment, and then working out which vendor has the best options for us. All of the above. I think that's probably right. There are steps to be able to use our phone for almost everything, and we'll go through what the smartphone group have been doing. So hopefully that will reduce the cost. But I think there's a number of these. I'm surprised that no one said they don't work as well as the clinician, but perhaps you're already the 6 out of you who've said all of the above, including that one as well. I don't think they work as well as a clinician, and I run a company that does this. I think that there are some things that clinicians do much better than any digital tools, perhaps not monitoring change, but definitely in identifying deficits. So to get to the AGI, the Ataxia Global Initiative, as Jennifer mentioned, we have a number of working groups, and we're up to number 4. So we're in the digital motor biomarkers one, and we fit within the context of these 8. And I guess we're talking in number 8 at the moment. So we've got 2 of them included at the moment. Our goal is in this group is to establish standards for aggregating digital motor data sets. So that's quite challenging in itself, and I'll go through why that's so hard. Harmonizing a standardized assessment protocol across clinics, also very hard. And I will show you in particular a use case of why that's really challenging just within one of our work programs. So we have 5 of them. So we have our digital group, and then we have, which has about 100 members, and then each of those is split up into 5 different specific domains of assessment. So working package 1 is focusing on balance and gait, and we have Winfried in Tübingen, and we have Faye in the west coast of the States. And I'm going to go through in each of these work packages what some of the work is that they're doing and some of the challenges that they're presenting with. This particular work group is definitely the most advanced in that this technology is being used in trials already in a number of different settings. Their objective is to work out really what the best measures are, whether or not they can bring digital technologies to clinical trials in particular, but also clinical practice, so that they are transferable between clinics, also easily interpretable and meaningful for the patients and regulators. And that's an important aspect of the assessments. This first, I've got a few example studies of where people have been trying to improve their the reach of their digital marker. This is by the Tübingen group, so Winfried, and they're looking at finding some real-world examples of testing environments that will perform. Ideally, I think they're looking for something that performs better than what you can do in the clinic, but also something that provides an objective marker while patients are in their home, for example. And what they were doing was looking at a number of patients with genetically inherited ataxia and comparing them to healthy controls. And they had 3 different assessment domains. One was lab-based. And so all of these different conditions were using digital assessments, but they're actually just in different environments. So there's a nice lab at the hospital in Tübingen down in the basement where they have their setup, which looks at number of sensors that you can have. They're actually the Opal sensors, so they're actually from the company APDM, and both of these environments, both of these studies I'm talking about are using that technology. But also Winfried has his own technology and has been using things like Microsoft, like an Xbox, so something that's a consumer grade assessment of measurement. But in these 3 environments, lab-based, 5-minute supervised walking. So this is within the hospital, and then real life walking, which is 4 to 6 hours of movement in the home. I can already see the challenges that you might have with a protocol that sets up for 4 to 6 hours. But what they did find was that lab-based assessments easily separated patients, and that's what you'd expect. These are ataxic patients, and what they were trying to do is show that there's an equal ability of these real-life assessments to separate the groups out. Because if you can send a sensor home to a patient and they can just do this in the home before they come to the clinic, you've already got some data there that allows you to make some judgments about performance. What you can see, though, I think, is that there's increasing variability of the groups in the real life situation. So you're having a wider spread of the ataxic patients who may or may not be able to perform closer to a healthy control when they're in the home, because perhaps they're more familiar with the environment. They also showed changes in function over a 1-year period. And in some of those cases, there was no change in the SARA. So there's actually no change in disease severity, but there were some subtle changes in performance on some of their movement measures that they're interested in. This second, I think we've got 2 studies here I'm talking about by Faye Horvath and Christopher Gomez. So as I mentioned, Faye's on the West Coast and Chris is in Chicago. They have managed to convince a number of drug companies to give them a lot of money to run a natural history study looking at digital markers in the home. One of their goals was to set up a digital equivalent of the SARA. So one that is run almost exclusively, or I think exclusively, through digital assessments rather than relying on a clinician, which is interesting and an admirable goal. If you're an opponent of the SARA itself, then trying to develop a digital tool that is replicating a flawed human-based assessment is a huge challenge. But what they're trying to do is work out whether or not they can develop a digital assessment of disease severity, use it in daily life, collect longitudinal data, and then they also wanted to see, can they do some of these things just with consumer-grade products like an iPhone or an Apple Watch? So this is part of the setup for their wearable technologies. It's not something you'd be wearing around too much, because you can see how many sensors they have on the individual. But this is by a company called APDM. There's a disclosure that Faye is one of the founders of that company. But they do a reasonable job at developing this kind of technology. But you can see that it is wired, so it provides measurement both mainly around walking, gait, and balance. Their upper limb assessments are slightly limited, but we do have a working package for upper limb as well. But just to provide an example of the sort of data that they're looking at is focused around things like stance width and positioning of the feet and their toes within a walking paradigm. And then they can compare those measures to healthy individuals. And we've got some data here where we can see natural stance of individuals, where we've got grey for healthy controls. And this is what we have on the left. And then if you compare that to a cerebellar subject, you can see that there's a huge amount of variance. And it's part of that variance that we're able to measure. And we're focusing on metrics like area, velocity, and frequency. There is a strong interest in separating out subgroups in the spinocerebellar ataxias. And we can see from the data that's provided by Faye's group is that the scars here that we at least have, scars 1, 2, 3, and 6, so the most common, all present with a relatively similar profile when it comes to the metrics that we're measuring here, but they all do separate the groups out. There's also a reasonable relationship with disease severity. and some of these getting up to around 0.7, I think is the highest we can see here. This goes back to that argument around whether or not you're using these digital markers to replicate disease severity, or whether or not you're using them to replicate a meaningful marker in someone's performance. And that is something like walking. Walking is a component of disease severity, but it's not the overall patient in themselves. So I personally see value in focusing on the meaningful components of someone's presentation, not necessarily disease severity, because I think disease severity is done really well by the clinician. Second working package is upper limb. And the image that we have here is a new upper limb assessment that uses things like a cup or a spoon. And if you think about the utility of those two devices in our daily lives, then you're already creating something that's meaningful for the patient and probably for the regulators as well, in that we all use a spoon most days to eat, and we all use a cup. So if we can measure upper limb function using this kind of technology, then there's some advantages there. Part of the motivation for developing new upper limb assessments is that in many of the clinical trials, if you can't walk, so if you're non-ambulant, you are then excluded from a number of drug trials because they rely on assessments of gait and balance. And if you can't stand and walk, then you can't be included in the study. So there's a real push for upper limb assessments that are meaningful, but also sensitive to disease over time. These slides are, so this group, I should have said, is run by Andreas Tübingen and Anupam Gupta, who's in Boston. And they are trying to, along with a number of other groups, trying to find some meaningful upper limb measurements that represent a whole bunch of different domains. One is a clinical rating scale, so like SARA, patient-reported outcomes, so things like the FARS ADL, or actual functional tests like the 9-hole peg test or the box and block test. So if you can get a tool that represents all of these domains, then you are doing really well, but it's quite hard. If you're familiar with things like the 9-hole peg test, it's still used as a primary outcome measure for a number of drug trials. It's a pretty reliable tool. It tracks quite closely to disease severity, but it's also really hard to do. It doesn't necessarily represent anything in a patient's life. And I think we could probably do better because the measurement of that tool itself is challenging. So we do have a number of different options available to us in terms of upper limb digital assessments. There's the oculomotor, which actually was developed for Huntington's disease originally. But you can see how this particular work package has split their decision-making matrix into things like what's standardized, what has ecological relevance. And you can see that we've got this AIMS down here, which is this one that I'm going to talk about now, because it's designed to represent what a patient does on a daily basis. So the Ataxia instrumented measure, which is spoon, so AIMS, and they also have a cup, has a different name. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's using relatively straightforward technology. So it's got an accelerometer in there, and it looks at things like inertial movement of the spoon. So you're literally holding a spoon and you're picking up some dried oats from a bowl, bringing it up to your mouth. You're not eating it because they don't need to eat for this particular assessment. And then you put it down, and you can do it with the left hand, right hand, and it's designed to, and you do a number of iterations of that, so you can wash out a little bit of the variability that you might see on there. They do have some pilot data here, which compared performance on the AIMS with performance with measures on the mFARS, so the modified FARS, the upper limb component of the FARS, 9-hole peg test, the box and block test. And I think you can already see a couple of advantages for the AIMS. Now, I will declare that I work with Louise Corbin. So she's one of the co-inventors of this, and she's based in Melbourne. but I don't have any financial interest in this, but I think it's a really neat tool. So that's why I'm talking about it. The 9-hole peg test, we can see a number of patients weren't even able to complete it. So already it's excluding people where otherwise we should be assessing them. We can also see that they have high sensitivity to change, and they actually have the highest sensitivity to change out of these 5 assessments. They've also got a strong correlation with the mFARS, and it's shaping up to be a really nice tool for a clinical practice and clinical trials. Working package 3, which is speech, which is a group that I'm running. I've got 2 studies that I wanted to just highlight the work in this space, because speech is ubiquitous. I mean, we all do it, and all of our patients do it. And whenever we listen to them, we can hear that there's something going wrong. So why not quantify that objectively? I've got a multiple sclerosis use case here, but they do have, in this case, they've got ataxia. So what we wanted to do was look at the viability of using digital markers of speech and link them to overall measures of disease severity and disability. So we've got the EDSS and the SARA. And we were looking at a speech measure that encompasses a number of aspects that are important for ataxia, and they include things like timing and coordination, but also pitch variability, things that you would hear in your patients themselves. Again, around a 0.7 correlation with disease severity. That's nice, and that's important. But as I mentioned before, I think it's important to consider that speech is only a subset or subcomponent of disease severity, and it's important in its own right as an assessment of domain. So what we want to get to is a clinician assessing a patient or recording their speech very briefly, maybe 30 seconds worth, and then providing a disease relevant score for that individual that relates to things more closely linked to their performance. We also had imaging in this study just to show that there were metrics in these in our study that related specifically to regions of interest. We also used speech to predict 9-hole peg test performance, and you think, well, maybe they're separate domains. I mean, one is upper limb and one is speech, but they're both motor control, and so there is definitely an overlap there. We saw an area under the curve around 0.87. For me, the most interesting aspect of this work was how we use the digital measure of speech to better separate disease severity measures. And so we've got, we also had, out of the 118 patients, we had a number of healthy controls. So we've got them sitting down here, and we had expert listeners, blinded expert listeners, go through and rate the individuals on a number of metrics, and they might relate to things like how intelligible that person is, how natural they sound, so how much do they deviate from a norm. And their ratings are in red here. So we can see disease severity increasing on the x-axis and speech disability increasing on the y-axis. Our ability to differentiate gradations of a healthy control are very limited, because we would say, okay, they sound healthy, but a machine would actually pick up some of those differences that are occurring in the person's speech or voice. And you can hear, I've just been talking for half an hour, my voice is actually starting to fail me a bit, and I'm coughing a little bit. Those fine-grained aspects of my voice that are degrading in front of you are picked up by digital assessments. They're not picked up by a listener necessarily in terms of an assessment rating scale. I think another important aspect here is that the digital assessments better separated out the groups compared to the listeners, where you can see there's an overlap between mild, moderate, and severe ratings, whereas the digital assessments cleanly separated them out. The second study I wanted to briefly mention was a pre-symptomatic, pre-manifest study that we looked at SCAR2, so dominantly inherited disorder. This is done with my colleagues, again in Tübingen, but also in Cuba, where there's a preponderance of SCAR2 in the East. And we had healthy controls, age and sex match healthy controls, early stage, so within the first 3 to 5 years of diagnosis, and pre-manifest, so carriers of the mutation, but not symptomatic overtly, and certainly not meeting any diagnostic criteria. These ratings we can see here are blinded expert listeners. There was no ability to separate pre-ataxic, which is the grey, from healthy controls. I mean, there's a little bit going on here with monopitch, but not reaching any statistical significance. Then if we use a digital assessment in the same tasks, we can see we're able to then pick up some subtle changes in performance. And this is on a syllable repetition task. In fact, it's just the pata task. So pata, 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 pata. We got them to do it 10 times quickly, for 10 seconds, quickly and clearly. And there was actually a sequencing deficit that was presenting after about 6 or 7 seconds in that particular task. So it's just an example of where the subtle differences in people's performance can be picked up digitally, but it can't be picked up by a human rater. Smartphone working package is run by 3 people, Helen, Andrea, and Kristalina. And Andrea is in Oxford, and Helen and Kristalina are in Exeter, so both in the UK. So I've spoken about 3 working groups that are much more developed in their progression, and the remaining 2 have had much less traction in the clinical trial space, at least. But you can see the smartphone and sensor working group is more a broad technology rather than a specific domain focus. So they're designed to try to bring in all of these other domains and see if we can just use a phone to do this assessment. I think the advantages are clear because we all have a phone, and it'd be very easy if we could just plonk it on the desk when a patient comes in and they can do something, or they just use their own phone and then upload the data to your own analytics cloud or pipeline. So that makes it cheaper, potentially simpler, depending on the technology you're using. And what they're finding is that gait and upper limb are platforms that are getting traction, and so they seem to be making some progress in that space. Oculomotor is a bit harder in that space to date. But most phones have accelerometers in them, which means that they are able to do things like activity measurement. There's definitely vendors out there who are doing cognition. We have voice assessments on our smartphones, and they're used in clinical trials. And so there is much more use of this particular technology, but it has a little bit of a way to go because the veracity of the data that's being acquired is not as accurate as high quality machinery. And so, I mean, plenty of people will tell you that it is as accurate, but unfortunately it's not. Even the microphones are much lower quality than what we would use in a lab. They are doing a number of systematic reviews to look at what progress is being made in this space. So the final working package is oculomotor and vestibular function. This is run by Alex, and I think he's in Germany. He may be in Switzerland, but excuse my ignorance there. He speaks German, so he could also be in Austria, but he's around your way. They have a big focus on trying to see what can be measured and what data is available for this kind of technology in a clinical trial space. They have a number of metrics that are useful, and certainly in the ataxias, this space is hugely valuable. I haven't seen any evidence of it in a clinical trial space because I think it's embryonic in its development there. But there is a focus on trying to get, and I think it would be great if it was on a smartphone, but trying to get one particular device or technology that can do all of this kind of work for us. But they're interested in digitizing. I mean, a lot of this stuff is already digital, but it requires specialized hardware. Smooth pursuit and saccadic eye movements, gaze holding, And then also things like vestibular ocular response. What they have been trying to show to date is that there are actually a number of these measures, things like smooth pursuit, which have been validated for use in different ataxias. You can see on the y-axis, we've got things like Friedreich's ataxia, ataxia telangiectasia, Niemann-Pick type C, and a number of the dominantly inherited scars or triplet repeats. There are a number of metrics that aren't suitable or even not recommended. So they are working their way through these. I think this is a space to watch, and I'd be really interested in trying to draw in some of this technology for our own lab. Okay, question 4. I said I'd give you a break, and here's the second, this is the last one. So what's the most appropriate environment to use, measure or record digital markers? Now I've touched on, certainly Winfried's study has focused on trying to provide a different context to do the assessments. And I imagine some of you are clinicians and purely clinicians. Where would you like to see this done? So is this something that's continuously monitored in the home before you get to clinic? Or is it a whole week of testing before they get to the clinic? Good luck getting a patient to do it for a week, by the way, but it sounds great. Maybe we just bring people into a clinic and you get them to do a challenge task while they're there, like 25-foot walk, but it's digitized. That's how we do our speech assessments. Is it passive data collection just during your assessment, like the ISARA that they're trying to do in the States? Or do we get them to do burst assessments or periodic assessments throughout the year in the waiting room, whenever they feel like it? Go for it. I'm interested to see what people think as an option here. The waiting room is very hard for speech because everybody is noisy. So as much as people would like to get it done there, and we always have people asking for it to be done in that circumstance, I don't want it to be happening. Okay. So we've got continuous monitoring in the home the week before clinic. I think that sounds good. Challenge tasks, that's my favorite actually, because I like having a controlled environment and you can restrict the hardware and the recording environments. Periodic testing throughout the year. So in this circumstance, there's a lot of proponents of this virtual trials and digital testing in the home. There's a whole movement. So perhaps the 10 of you who voted on that are part of that evangelical movement. I think there's definitely value in that as well. And some clinical trials are trying that as an approach rather than doing in the clinic, flying everybody in. Certainly with COVID, it's made it much harder to move through these things. So that brings me very close to the end of the talk. What we have been trying to do is to develop a validated objective marker of all of these different domains. The questions still remain, what is the best use of this technology? And perhaps it can cover all of the bases, but our focus is certainly on identifying early markers of symptom onset, so that pre-manifest, and we've been doing a lot of work in Huntington's and sort of other groups as another example. I think its best value at the moment is in measuring interventions because it is objective. It takes away some of the difficulties that we have with clinical trials and subjective, highly variable clinician ratings as a primary outcome measure in a trial, because you don't need as many patients because the variability is smaller and the data is objective. And I'm very happy to answer some questions when I get to the end of this one. I mentioned that there were questions around how you would get regulatory approval for a particular digital technology. And it's not just one thing that you need to do. There are, well, a good thing, there are many hoops that you need to jump through before you can demonstrate in a transparent way the efficacy of a particular digital endpoint. It needs to have be both sensitive and specific. Now, lots and lots of these digital measures are highly sensitive. And you will see lots of promotional material that says, voice is a good example. People will take a voice sample and say, see, looks like they've got something wrong with them. And then they'll show high sensitivity to schizophrenia, depression, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, with no specificity. So I think it's really important to consider those both with equal value. We do need to have a relatively robust correlation with overall disease severity. If it's not measuring something completely different, then it might be challenging, but don't be too obsessed with getting above 0.7 for any of these digital markers, because they are assessing specific domains of interest. Of course, we need to have it related to the underlying genetic information, but there's also a push to look at things like neurofilament light chain data, and if you're looking at things like amyloid deposits or any sort of proteins through imaging, that may be a better examination of underlying disease rather than these surface behaviors that we're focusing on. But we would always explore those genetic markers, for example. Test, retest, and inter-rater reliability is hugely important. So if I do a test, you should get the same data as if you do the test. And if you're not getting that, then there's obviously a problem. But also if I do it today and then I do it tomorrow, I should be getting something roughly similar, unless something has gone on, like I'm tired or I'm intoxicated. So having that information is really important. And then tracking disease over time. So in the absence of any treatment, can it reliably show progression of something that we know changes in the context of a disease? If you are interested in joining our Digital Motor Working Group, please do so. You can go to the ataxiaglobalinitiative.net website, and on there you can see that there are other working groups. It's very easy to join, or at least provide an expression of interest, and fill in that form, and Andreas and I will welcome you with open arms, and you can join one of our working packages, because the more the merrier, and it'd be great to get some more interest from people who are perhaps not embedded within our network already. You are welcome to get in touch via email and or LinkedIn. You can just tell me who you are and where you saw me. Otherwise, I think you're spam, but I'm very happy to interact with anyone further. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm happy to jump straight into the questions.
Yes, I think if you want, you could open the Q&A.
There's a question here. Would be glad to hear your opinion regarding use digital markers for therapy, feedback. How developed is this field, and do you have any advice for touch technology development? So there's actually quite a bit of work in the biofeedback space, which relies on the same sort of technology. So these are digital tools, but they are providing live feedback to patients. The best examples are probably in gait and balance and the lower limb space, and I can refer you to work again by Winfried and Ilm and Mathis Sinopchik. There's a number of papers published in movement disorders and neurology looking at that technology. We have just finished a large RCT in dysarthria therapy that was run across sites in Paris and Tübingen and a couple of sites in Australia and New Zealand. That was a biofeedback assessment tool, a therapy tool, where we were trying to enhance self-monitoring. So it's a tool that you can deliver to the home, and you can avoid any of the foibles that come with face-to-face clinical work. Sorry, I think I've got an echo here from my colleagues who may be in Germany.
Yeah, Heike, Jennifer, maybe you mute yourself when Adam is answering the questions.
There's another question here. In the follow-up of a patient, what specific task or patient-reported outcome tool would you suggest in gait and balance? gait and balance are not my specialties. I will just make that as just to highlight that immediately. Patient reported outcomes. There's actually a working group run by FARA, so the Friedreich Ataxia Research Association in the States. They've got an particular interest in this. I think my colleagues on the call probably could answer this as well. I don't want to speak for anybody or on their behalf. If they're in the clinic, I would continue to use things like the OPAL sensors that are provided by APDM. They're not cheap, but they have great data on how reliable and stable and sensitive they are. And they can give you information on gait and balance simultaneously. But there are a number of vendors who work in that space. I can't specifically talk to any of the proms, unfortunately. Sorry, Catalin. Yes, and there's an answer there saying you can always contact us at AGI for more information. That email won't go to me, but it'll go to someone who knows what they're talking about.
I would have a question. Maybe you could say a few more words on regarding speech, which is, I think, your favorite digital assessment. So how complicated is it to transfer any speech analysis algorithm to different languages? So what were your experiences and what is a challenge, or is there a challenge? Could you say a few more words on that?
There are challenges if you're focusing on the content of the speech. We argue that if you're looking at motor symptoms, then the manifestations of those motor disorders will be similar across things like German and English and Spanish and Italian. We have trials. In fact, we just got a new trial today, which is across 15 languages, and there's 60 sites. In that, we have the same measures and the same composite outcomes for disease severity. So if it's just speech looking at, then the difficulties are minimized. If you then, we also have another trial in frontotemporal dementia across 10 languages. That's really challenging. And we now need experts, linguistic experts in each of those languages to help us answer the questions. The data itself is easy to acquire and the protocols are relatively straightforward. We have the same sort of, so we still do pata as a task, and that's across all of the languages that certainly in the European languages, the Indo-European ones. And then you might have a reading task and you've got a sustained vowel, which is language agnostic. Maybe you do a counting task, but all of these things are relatively straightforward.
And maybe one quick last question. I think we are quite far in time. You mentioned that, of course, also the preclinical condition in the sense of not going to a mouse model, but before the onset of symptoms might be a very relevant phase or stage for such digital assessments, since clinical scales may lack sensitivity. But my question is going towards data protection. So if you say that you have a huge consortia in different countries, you might have a solution for this, but I could imagine that speech might be a sensitive parameter that cannot that easily be forwarded to anybody throughout the world, and that you have to tackle some challenges regarding data protection. So maybe you can just briefly comment on that. What is the solution? So obviously you have one.
Yes, it is. It's not straightforward. You do need to meet things like GDPR requirements or HIPAA in the States. There are a number of other acts. So California has its own legislation that restricts movement of data. Canada are looking at introducing different things. But you are able to move data across data centers and even out of jurisdictions if you adhere to specific privacy requirements. GDPR in particular, you need to be able to trace that data back. And if a patient wants to remove their data from the database, it has to be, it has to facilitate that process, as an example. Voice and speech are considered personal health information. So the requirements of the cloud infrastructure are just that much higher. But if you go with some of these vendors, something like us, like Redenlab, we get audited all the time by our customers, and they ensure that the product is meeting the requirements of this kind of legislation.
Okay, thank you. I thought it was the last question, but I think we got
two more in the chat.
Yeah, I think it's only one.
Well, Martina is part of our group, our speech group, so I'm happy to liaise with her in a separate time. If there's which speech parameter would be suitable to detect changes over time from your speech? Well, in Ataxia, it's going to be a timing related deficit. So a timing metric but I think it would probably be a composite of a number of different speech features that best represent disease change. Digital markers used in animal models, we actually do things like ultrasonic voice, ultrasonic vocalizations for mice. We actually did some in SCAR3 in Tübingen, and there are a number of different things relating to activity and movement for mice. I mean, but they don't have a smartphone, but it's a similar principle. That was nice and quick for you, Jennifer.
Okay, so thank you. If there aren't any more questions, we thank you a lot for your interesting talk.
Pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. Again, if anyone wants to reach out, by all means, email me or connect through any other means.
Okay.
Bye then.
Bye.
Cheers.